Welcome back to XRP Unfiltered. Today we're diving into a subject that consistently divides the crypto community straight down the center. You've likely come across social media posts suggesting that owning 10,000 XRP could fundamentally change a family's future. Some people view those statements as motivational, others see them as completely unrealistic. And somewhere between those two reactions, the core issue often gets overlooked. Why are people even framing XRP in terms of long-term multi-generational value in the first place? That's exactly what we're unpacking today. Not hype, not emotional clickbait, and not exaggerated promises, but the reasoning behind why these discussions keep surfacing. And before we go any further, it's important to be absolutely clear. The community models you see circulating online, including those that reference assumed future valuations like $1,000 or $5,000, are illustrative concepts only. They are not forecasts, not assurances, and not financial advice. They exist purely as hypothetical frameworks people use to visualize what long-term transformation might look like if this technology continues to develop in the way some believe it could. Once you remove the emotional reaction, the discussion becomes far more compelling. Because when a community begins thinking in terms of decades or generations, it often signals that something deeper is taking shape beneath the surface, something connected not to short-term price speculation, but to the gradual evolution of financial infrastructure itself. And while these hypothetical models circulate widely online, something much more tangible has been unfolding quietly in the background. Institutional capital has started positioning itself in XRP at a scale we haven't previously witnessed. Spot XRP ETFs have now surpassed $1 billion in assets under management. What's notable isn't just the milestone, but the way it occurred. No hype-driven campaigns, no retail frenzy, no emotional surges, just steady, disciplined inflows from asset managers known for acting slowly, cautiously, and with deliberate intent. That pattern matters. When institutions accumulate quietly, it's not because they saw a viral post or a bold price prediction. It's because they understand liquidity structures, regulatory frameworks, and settlement mechanics. Their focus is on whether an asset can play a role within the broader financial system, not next week or next month, but over many years. And that's where the connection between community-driven long-term thought experiments and institutional capital flows becomes clearer. They may speak very different languages, but both perspectives center on the same fundamental question. What happens if XRP becomes embedded into real-world settlement infrastructure? Online models express this idea narratively. Institutions approach it through structure, supply dynamics, custody solutions, regulated instruments, and liquidity constraints. When two very different groups, retail communities and conservative asset managers, begin concentrating on the same asset from different angles, it's usually worth paying attention. None of this implies guaranteed outcomes. None of it suggests the future is already determined. What it does indicate is that XRP continues to be discussed in contexts that go far beyond price charts. Conversations about financial plumbing, interoperability, efficient settlement, and large-scale tokenization. That's why people explore long-term potential, not because they expect quick wealth, but because the underlying technology intersects with structural change that unfolds over long periods. So rather than treating ideas like the 10,000 XRP model as literal predictions, it's more productive to see them as reflections of how people conceptualize long-term value when they observe an asset gradually integrating into institutional frameworks. It's a mental exercise, not a roadmap, and the mindset behind it, patience, discipline, long-range thinking, aligns far more closely with how major financial players operate than many retail investors realize. That context is especially important right now because the gap between short-term price frustration and long-term structural development has rarely been wider. And that's where today's deeper conversation truly begins. When people talk about the 10,000 XRP concept, most outsiders misunderstand what's actually being discussed. They assume it's a promise, a prediction, or some shortcut to wealth. In reality, those sharing these posts are often attempting to articulate a mindset, a way of thinking about long-term value, disciplined ownership, and how a maturing financial system could reshape how families interact with assets across generations. is not about expecting XRP to reach unrealistic levels overnight. It's about exploring scenarios that encourage deeper thinking around patience, infrastructure, and intergenerational planning. So let's clarify this carefully and responsibly. When community discussions reference figures like $1,000 or $5,000, these are not projections or claims about what will happen. They're symbolic placeholders, tools used to imagine what long-term maturation of a utility-driven asset might look like if the ecosystem were to expand significantly. The numbers themselves are not the point. You could substitute any figures and the underlying philosophical exercise would remain the same. The goal is to explore how long-term systems thinking differs from short-term speculation. This is something seen repeatedly in early communities around emerging technologies. It happened with cloud computing, electric vehicles, mobile connectivity, and digital payments. Simplified models are used to discuss what adoption could mean decades down the line, not because the path is known, but because the potential scale of transformation is understood. The objective isn't precision, it's perspective. The commonly shared hypothetical framework usually begins with a simple idea. If someone acquires a fixed quantity of an asset early, and that asset gains relevance as its utility expands, what could that imply for future generations? Again, this is not a forecast. It's a narrative construct meant to promote long-term discipline. The idea of never selling, for instance, is less about literal behavior and more about examining how wealthy families historically manage productive or appreciating assets. They leverage, reinvest, build around them, and maintain ownership over extended periods. Whether one agrees with that philosophy or not, it represents a shift away from rapid profit-seeking and toward structural thinking. It trains the mind to evaluate assets not based on weekly volatility, but on long-term utility and network development. And when people apply that lens to XRP, it's because XRP is increasingly referenced in discussions around settlement mechanics, tokenization, and cross-border infrastructure, domains that evolve over decades, not days. Another reason these hypothetical frameworks resonate is because they draw attention to something the broader market often ignores: the difference between price behavior and infrastructure progress. Price is emotional, noisy, and driven by short-term sentiment. Infrastructure development is slow, deliberate, and largely invisible until it reaches a tipping point. When people talk about holding XRP for long-term scenarios, they're often acknowledging that utility-driven assets don't behave like speculative ones. If value grows, it tends to reflect adoption rather than hype cycles. There's also a psychological layer here. Most market participants are conditioned to focus on immediate results, quick wins, and instant gratification. Long-term thinking is uncomfortable. It demands patience, tolerance for uncertainty, and the ability to separate noise from signal. That's why discussions framed in decades stand out. They run counter to typical retail behavior. It also explains why critics frequently mock these conversations. Dismissing long-term thinking is easier than confronting the reality that meaningful structural change takes time. Ironically, institutions, the same ones now entering XRP via ETFs, naturally operate with long horizons. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurers, and asset managers routinely plan over multi-decade timelines. They don't care about daily candles. They care about whether a system solves problems efficiently and predictably at scale. So when communities use hypothetical figures to imagine a future ecosystem, they're not guessing price. They're aligning psychologically with how long-term capital thinks. You can disagree with the scenarios, but the mindset behind them reflects maturity, not recklessness. The true value of the 10,000 XRP discussion isn't the model itself. It's the reminder that long-term potential is rarely obvious in the moment. Those who think in decades, rather than days, often interpret market structure, regulation, and institutional behavior very differently. Stepping away from community speculation and examining actual market structure around XRP reveals a stark contrast. While online models spark debate, institutional behavior unfolding today is measurable and increasingly difficult to ignore. This is where the conversation shifts from imagination to mechanics, from discussion to action. A prime example is the rapid expansion of spot XRP ETFs. Surpassing $1 billion in assets under management is not insignificant, especially without hype. What matters most is the pattern behind it. Consistent inflows, disciplined accumulation, and minimal marketing. That's not retail behavior. That's structured capital positioning quietly. Flow data reinforces this point. These ETFs are absorbing substantial amounts of circulating XRP daily. Under current conditions, that equates to millions of tokens moving from liquid markets into regulated custody each day. This doesn't promise future price outcomes, but mechanically it reduces available supply. Historically, when supply tightens alongside sustained interest, market dynamics eventually adjust. Timing and scale remain unknown, but the mechanics are clear. This highlights a key divergence between retail and institutional approaches. Retail focuses on charts, frustration, and narratives. Institutions focus on access, regulation, and exposure pathways. ETF participation is not noise, it's structural positioning. Firms like Franklin Templeton and Bitwise don't move impulsively. They act when a long-term framework begins to form. WisdomTree's recent data further supports this, showing XRP as one of the few digital assets attracting consistent institutional inflows across multiple regions, North America, Europe, and Asia. Even as many others experienced outflows, that doesn't predict outcomes, but it reveals professional sentiment grounded in utility and readiness. XRP's role in settlement conversations further distinguishes it. Unlike many assets driven primarily by narrative, XRP is consistently discussed in relation to payments, cross-border liquidity, and tokenization. That's not hype, that's infrastructure positioning. ETF custody further reinforces this. Tokens held in regulated vehicles are effectively removed from active circulation. Over time, persistent inflows alter market structure. Again, no guarantees, just changing mechanics. Institutions move slowly, testing quietly and scaling deliberately. That pattern is visible now. The reality is straightforward. Institutional participation is growing, supply is transitioning into regulated custody, and global demand remains resilient. These are early signals of structural evolution. Price may lag, but structure precedes valuation. Beyond speculation lies the real utility conversation happening behind closed doors. This brings us to recent commentary from Sal G, offering insight into how traditional finance views XRP. When he describes XRP as a bridge asset for large-scale settlement, he's highlighting its core design. Settlement assets are meant to move quickly, efficiently, and reliably. XRP's design aligns with those requirements. What's notable is that even partial understanding still captures the core truth. XRP's relevance stems from function, not hype. RIP